One family, one murder, one empire only weeks away from collapse. For centuries, the House of Yusupov stood among the richest aristocratic dynasties in Russia. Their fortune rivaled that of Europe's greatest noble families. Their palaces held priceless paintings, legendary jewels, and treasures collected over generations. Their name opened every door in St. Petersburg. It seemed impossible that a dynasty with such wealth and influence could ever disappear. Then came the night of 16 to 17 December 1916, according to the old-style calendar, or 29 to 30 December under the new style. Inside the Yusupov Palace on the Moika River, 5 conspirators gathered. Prince Felix Yusupov, Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, State Duma Deputy Vladimir Purishkevich, Lieutenant Sergei Sukotin, and physician Stanislav Lazaver carried out one of the most famous political assassinations in modern history. Their target was Grigori Rasputin, the Siberian mystic whose influence over the imperial family had become a symbol of the empire's deepening crisis. The conspirators believed they were saving Russia, but history would remember them very differently. Felix Yusupov expected the death of Rasputin to strengthen the monarchy. Instead, it became one of the final dramatic acts before the Romanov Empire collapsed altogether. Within months, the throne would fall, the imperial government would vanish, and the privileged world that had protected the Yusupovs for generations would cease to exist. There's a cruel irony here. The man who helped eliminate the empire's most controversial advisor could not save the empire itself. Even Tsar Nicholas II refused to celebrate the assassination. Rather than rewarding the conspirators, he punished them. Felix Yusupov was exiled to his family estate at Rakitnoy, while Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich was transferred to the Persian front. When members of the imperial family pleaded for mercy, Nicholas II reportedly answered with a sentence that would soon echo through history. No one has the right to take justice into his own hands. Those words came only weeks before the entire imperial order began to unravel. Soon, palaces would be abandoned. Fortunes would disappear. Masterpieces by Rembrandt would become a family's lifeline instead of its decoration. One of Russia's wealthiest princes would flee his homeland carrying jewels instead of power. And the greatest punishment awaiting Felix Yusupov would not be exile. It would be spending the next 51 years watching the world remember him for a single winter night that he believed would save his country. Long before Felix Yusupov walked into that candlelit room in December 1916, the empire around him had already begun to crack. You can trace the beginning of the collapse back years before the assassination. Russia remained one of Europe's largest empires. Yet beneath its magnificent palaces and military parades, confidence in the monarchy was steadily disappearing. Every political crisis weakened the authority of Tsar Nicholas II, and every military setback made the future look less certain. Then came the First World War. Instead of restoring Russia's prestige, the conflict placed unbearable pressure on the imperial government. Resources became scarce, public frustration grew, and faith in the Romanov dynasty declined. While ordinary Russians faced hardship, rumors spread throughout Petrograd that Grigori Rasputin exercised extraordinary influence over the imperial family through Empress Alexandra. Whether those rumors were true mattered less than the fact that millions believed them. To members of the old aristocracy, Rasputin became the visible face of imperial decline. Felix Yusupov shared that belief. Young, wealthy, and born into one of Russia's greatest noble houses, he became convinced that removing Rasputin would save both the monarchy and his family's future. He was not acting for personal revenge or financial gain. He believed he was performing a patriotic duty. But that belief blinded him to a much larger reality. By late 1916, the empire's problems reached far beyond one controversial advisor. Military failures, political paralysis, and growing public anger could not be solved by eliminating a single man. Even if Rasputin disappeared, the forces pulling the empire apart would remain. When Rasputin was killed during the night of 16 to 17 December 1916, old style, Felix believed history had changed direction. Instead, history barely paused. Nicholas II reacted in a way the conspirators had never expected. Rather than praising them, he punished them. Felix was exiled to his family's estate at Rakitnoy, while Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich was sent to the Persian front. The emperor's reported response was simple but unmistakable. No one has the right to take justice into his own hands. Within only a few months, the assassination that was meant to preserve the Romanov throne would become little more than a footnote in a revolution that neither Felix nor the imperial court could stop. And then, in 1917, the world the Yusupovs had inherited over centuries began collapsing faster than anyone believed possible. You can almost hear the silence inside the Moika Palace. It is late on the night of December 16th, 1916, according to the old-style calendar. Outside, Petrograd lies beneath the winter darkness. Inside one of the city's most magnificent aristocratic residences, every detail has been carefully prepared. The man expected to arrive is Grigori Rasputin, the peasant mystic whose influence over the imperial court has become the subject of endless rumors. Waiting for him is Prince Felix Yusupov. He is not alone. The conspiracy also includes Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, Vladimir Purishkevich, Sergei Sukotin, and Dr. Stanislav Lazavert. 5 men, each convinced that history is about to change forever. Felix believes he is saving Russia, but history rarely follows the plans of conspirators. According to Felix's memoirs, the evening unfolded with poisoned food, poisoned wine, gunshots, and a desperate struggle before Rasputin finally died. It is a story that became famous across the world, inspiring books, films, and countless retellings. For decades, millions accepted it as the definitive account of the murder. Yet modern historians tell a more complicated story. Contemporary forensic analysis and later historical research have challenged several of the most dramatic details described by Felix. The famous tale of cyanide hidden in cakes and wine, along with the image of Rasputin surviving impossible injuries before collapsing at last, is not supported by the available medical evidence. Much of what the world believes about that night comes primarily from Felix Yusupov's own memoirs, published in 1928, more than a decade after the events themselves. That uncertainty makes the story even more fascinating. The assassination is one of the best-known crimes in Russian history, yet parts of its most famous version remain disputed more than a century later. What is beyond dispute is what happened next. Instead of celebrating the conspirators, Tsar Nicholas II ordered punishment. Felix was exiled to Rakitnoy, while Dmitry Pavlovich was transferred to the Persian front. The emperor rejected the idea that murder could be justified, no matter how noble the motive appeared. The conspirators had hoped to rescue the Romanov throne. Instead, they watched as the throne itself began to disappear beneath them. Within only a few months, revolution would sweep through Russia, and the Yusupov family would discover that losing political influence was only the beginning. Their unimaginable fortune was about to become the only thing standing between survival and ruin. The revolution did not give the Yusupov family time to mourn the empire they had lost. Instead, it forced them to think like fugitives. After the February Revolution of 1917, Felix Yusupov and his family briefly returned to their palace on the Moika in Petrograd. The building that had once hosted glittering receptions now stood in a country that was rapidly slipping beyond their control. Every hour increased the danger. Every delay meant another chance that revolutionary authorities would seize everything they owned. So they chose carefully. They could not save an entire dynasty's fortune, but they could save enough to survive. Among the possessions they removed were some of the family's most valuable jewels and two paintings by Rembrandt. Those masterpieces had once symbolized unimaginable wealth. Soon, they would become something far more practical, the price of survival. But even priceless art could not guarantee safety. As Russia descended into civil war, the Yusupovs joined other members of the former imperial elite in Crimea. The old world was shrinking with astonishing speed. Friends disappeared, estates were confiscated, and every rumor carried news of another noble family fleeing or vanishing forever. Then, in the spring of 1919, rescue finally arrived. Together with the Dowager Empress Maria Feodorovna and other members of the Romanov family, the Yusupovs boarded the British battleship HMS Marlborough in Yalta. The vessel carried them away from Russia to Malta, leaving behind not only their homeland but also the life they had always expected to live. It was not a triumphant departure. It was an escape. The journey across Europe brought fresh uncertainty. According to Felix Yusupov's own memoirs and later biographical accounts, he encountered serious problems while traveling through Italy because he lacked the necessary documents. The story says he persuaded officials to let him continue by paying them with diamonds from the family collection. Independent confirmation of this episode is limited, but it became one of the most memorable stories of his exile. There's another painful irony here. A prince whose ancestors had owned palaces was now using loose gemstones as travel documents. By 1920, the Yusupovs settled permanently in Paris. They had escaped with their lives, but almost everything else had been left behind forever. The murder that Felix believed would preserve his family's future had ended with the family becoming refugees. And exile, as they were about to discover, was only the beginning of a much longer struggle. When the Yusupovs reached Paris in 1920, they were safe. But safety was not the same as security. Only a few years earlier, Felix Yusupov had belonged to one of the wealthiest families in the Russian Empire. His inheritance included magnificent palaces, priceless collections of art, and family treasures accumulated over centuries. Almost all of it had vanished with the revolution. What remained could fit inside luggage. The jewels and valuables the family had managed to remove from Russia were no longer symbols of prestige. They became a reserve for survival. Among the most valuable possessions were two paintings by Rembrandt, taken from the family's palace after the February Revolution of 1917. Once admired as masterpieces decorating aristocratic halls, they now represented something much more basic: food, shelter, and the chance to build a new life. But even great wealth disappears faster than most people imagine. The Yusupovs soon discovered that exile carried expenses no Russian noble had ever expected. Maintaining a household abroad, supporting relatives, and adapting to life in France required constant sacrifices. Piece by piece, family treasures that had survived wars and generations of inheritance entered the international art market. There's another striking irony in their story. The family had once measured its fortune in estates and collections that seemed impossible to exhaust. Now, every jewel sold bought only a little more time. Unlike countless refugees who escaped with almost nothing, Felix and his wife, Princess Irina, possessed enough valuables to avoid immediate poverty. Yet their lives were transformed beyond recognition. The grandeur of imperial Russia had been replaced by careful financial decisions, uncertainty, and the knowledge that every sale permanently erased another piece of the family's history. The greatest loss, however, could not be replaced with money. No painting could recover their homeland. No diamond could restore the empire that had given their family its place in history. As years passed, Felix searched for another way to preserve what remained of his legacy. If the Yusupovs could no longer protect their palaces or fortunes, perhaps they could protect their version of the past. That decision would lead him to publish his famous memoirs in 1928, telling the world exactly how he believed Rasputin had died. The book would make Felix Yusupov internationally famous once again, but it would also spark a controversy that historians are still debating more than a century later. Exile did not erase Felix Yusupov's past. It magnified it. By the late 1920s, Europe knew his name for one reason above all others. He was the prince who had killed Rasputin. While thousands of Russian émigrés struggled to rebuild anonymous lives across France, Serbia, Germany, and China, Felix carried a burden unlike theirs. Wherever he appeared, people wanted the same story. How exactly had Rasputin died? In 1928, Felix answered that question himself. He published his memoirs, offering a dramatic account of the assassination. According to his version, Rasputin consumed poison cakes and wine, survived the poison, endured multiple gunshots, and continued fighting before finally dying. The story was extraordinary. Newspapers embraced it. Readers around the world repeated it. Before long, Felix's description became the version most people accepted as historical fact. But history is not always written by the most accurate witness. Modern historians and later forensic examinations have challenged several of the memoir's most sensational details. The famous cyanide story, the seemingly supernatural survival of the poison, and other dramatic moments are not supported by the available medical evidence. Instead, researchers believe that much of the world's image of Rasputin's final hours comes primarily from Felix's own recollections, written more than a decade after the murder. That debate continues today. Yet regardless of which details were true, the memoir achieved something remarkable. Felix had transformed himself from an exiled aristocrat into the principal narrator of one of the 20th century's most famous political assassinations. His version shaped novels, documentaries, and feature films for generations. Then another unexpected battle began. In 1932, the Hollywood studio MGM released the film Rasputin and the Empress. Felix and his wife, Princess Irina, believed the film falsely portrayed her and damaged her reputation. Rather than remaining silent, they took the powerful American studio to court. Against expectations, they won. The lawsuit ended with substantial financial compensation. Historians widely agree that the case became an important reason Hollywood studios increasingly adopted the familiar disclaimer stating that fictional films should not be understood as portraying real people accurately. There's another remarkable irony here. The prince who once believed he had changed Russian history with a pistol helped change film history with a courtroom victory. Yet even legal success could not restore everything the revolution had taken. His wealth was gone. His homeland remained beyond reach. Only his story and the controversy surrounding it continued to grow. By the early 1930s, Felix Yusupov had survived revolution, civil war, and exile. But the past refused to release him. In Paris, he and Princess Irina built a quieter life than the one they had known in Imperial Russia. Their daughter, Irina Felixova Yusupova, born on March 21, 1915, grew up far from the palaces where her family had once lived. She belonged to a generation that remembered Russia not through personal experience, but through stories photographs and fading family traditions. For Felix, however, every day carried the weight of memory. The world continued to associate his name with a single event, the assassination of Rasputin. Journalists sought interviews. Readers bought his memoirs. Historians debated his version of the murder. Even after establishing a new life in France, he could never escape the consequences of one winter night in December 1916. But the greatest struggle was no longer against political enemies. It was against time itself. With every passing year, another witness disappeared. Another member of the old imperial elite died. The Russian Empire survived only in conversations among émigrés who gathered in cafes, private apartments, and community organizations across Paris. Their homeland no longer existed in the form they had known, yet they continued preserving its customs, language, and memories. Felix became one of the most recognizable faces of that community. There is another irony here. He had once belonged to a family whose history stretched back for centuries. Yet future generations would remember him primarily for a single decision made over the course of one evening. Even the objects that had saved the family's future reminded him of everything that had been lost. The jewels carried out of Russia, the paintings that had once decorated the Moika Palace, and the memories preserved in his books all represented fragments of a vanished world that could never be rebuilt. Unlike countless political figures whose names slowly disappeared from public memory, Felix remained famous until the end of his life. His memoirs ensured that every new generation rediscovered both the mystery of Rasputin and the fate of the Yusupov family. Yet fame could not erase exile. It could not return confiscated estates. It could not restore an empire. As the decades passed and Europe itself entered another devastating war, the former prince watched history continue without the world into which he had been born. And eventually, only one final chapter remained, the end of the last man whose name had become inseparable from the death of Rasputin. The fall of the Yusupov family was not an isolated tragedy. It was part of a much larger transformation that changed the entire world. When Felix Yusupov left Russia in 1919, he was not simply abandoning a palace or a fortune. He was leaving behind a social order that had existed for generations. The Russian Empire that had once stretched across vast territories disappeared, and millions of people connected to the old system suddenly found themselves without a country that recognized their status. The Yusupovs were only one family among thousands. Across Europe, Russian aristocrats, officers, diplomats, and intellectuals became refugees. Some arrived in Paris. Others settled in Berlin, Belgrade, Constantinople, and later in cities across North and South America. They carried passports from nations that no longer existed, titles that no longer gave them power, and memories of a homeland they could never return to. But the consequences of the revolution reached far beyond Russia's borders. The collapse of the Romanov Empire changed the balance of power in Europe. A monarchy that had existed for more than 300 years disappeared in a matter of months. The Bolsheviks created a completely different political system, built around communist ideology rather than hereditary rule. For people like Felix Yusupov, this was more than a political change. It was the destruction of an entire identity. A prince was no longer a prince. A noble estate was no longer a home. A family archive became a collection of memories scattered across foreign countries. The Yusupovs represented a generation that experienced a unique historical tragedy. They had been born into a world where family names carried influence, where palaces represented permanence, and where wealth appeared impossible to lose. Then, within a few years, all of those assumptions disappeared. The bitter irony was that Felix had once believed he was acting to preserve Russia's future. By removing Rasputin, he hoped to protect the monarchy from collapse. Instead, he witnessed the end of the very system that had given his family everything. His story became a symbol of a wider question faced by thousands of exiles. What happens when the world that created you no longer exists? For the Russian emigre community in France, the answer was complicated. They built churches, newspapers, cultural organizations, and social circles to preserve their lost homeland. They tried to keep alive the language and traditions of Imperial Russia while living permanently outside its borders. But time was their greatest enemy. The first generation remembered Russia. The next generation inherited only stories. And as decades passed, the final witnesses of the old empire slowly disappeared, leaving behind only photographs, letters, and family names that once carried unimaginable power. Among them was Felix Yusupov himself, the man whose life had become permanently connected to the death of Rasputin and the fall of an empire. Time changed the Yusupov family in a way that no revolution could have predicted. The dynasty that once owned enormous estates and magnificent palaces survived not through power, but through memory. By the second half of the 20th century, the world that created the Yusupovs existed only in photographs, museums, and the stories of those who had escaped. The Russian Empire was gone. The aristocratic privileges were gone. The political influence of the family had disappeared forever. But the family name remained. Felix Yusupov lived long enough to become a symbol of a vanished era. After leaving Russia, he spent the rest of his life in France, far from the palaces where he had been raised. He was no longer a prince surrounded by servants and wealth. He was an exile who depended on the resources he had managed to save and on the reputation created by his famous memoirs. Yet there was one thing the revolution could not take away: his story. Felix and Princess Irina had only one child, Irina Felixova Yusupova, born on March 21, 1915. She represented the continuation of a family line that had survived one of the greatest political disasters of the 20th century. But survival did not mean restoration. The descendants of the Yusupovs would never return to the world their ancestors had known. They inherited a famous name, but not the empire that had given that name its power. This was the reality faced by thousands of former Russian noble families. Some descendants became artists. Others entered ordinary professions. Some remained connected to Russian émigré communities, preserving traditions that had already disappeared inside the Soviet Union. The Yusupovs followed a similar path. Their history became less about wealth and more about remembrance. The palaces that once belonged to them became museums. The collections that filled their rooms were scattered across different countries. The jewels that represented centuries of family fortune disappeared into private collections and auction houses. Only fragments remained, but those fragments carried a powerful message. The fall of the Yusupovs showed that political power and financial security could disappear almost overnight. A family could possess everything a person might desire: wealth, titles, influence, and social status, and still lose it all because history moved in a different direction. Felix Yusupov died in Paris on September 27, 1967, after more than 5 decades of marriage to Princess Irina. She survived him for less than 3 years, dying on February 26, 1970. Both were buried at the Russian cemetery of Sainte-Geneviève-des-Bois near Paris. Their graves became one of the final reminders of a lost world. A world where princes lived in palaces. A world that disappeared forever. But the story of the Yusupovs did not end with Felix's death. Decades later, their descendants would continue carrying a name that remained connected to one of the most famous nights in Russian history. Today, the name Yusupov no longer represents political power. It represents a memory. The family that once owned some of the greatest treasures of Imperial Russia survived into the modern era not through wealth or influence, but through the stories left behind. The palaces, estates, and collections that defined their world were scattered across different countries, but the name remained connected to one unforgettable moment in history: the assassination of Rasputin, the fall of an empire, the disappearance of an entire social class. The descendants of Felix and Irina Yusupov continued the family line after exile, carrying a surname that still attracts historians, filmmakers, and visitors interested in the final years of Imperial Russia. They inherited no empire and no political authority. What they inherited was a complicated legacy, a legacy filled with both admiration and controversy, because Felix Yusupov was not remembered simply as a wealthy prince. He was remembered as the man who participated in one of the 20th century's most famous political murders. But his life was also the story of survival after losing everything. He lived almost 51 years after the death of Rasputin. During that time, he witnessed the collapse of the monarchy he tried to protect, the disappearance of his family's fortune, and the transformation of Russian aristocrats into refugees scattered across the world. His final years in France were a reminder that history does not always reward those who try to control it. Felix wanted to change Russia's future. Instead, he became a witness to its destruction. The Yusupov story raises a question that extends far beyond one family or one assassination. What remains when everything that defines a person disappears? A title can vanish. A fortune can disappear. A country can cease to exist. But memory can survive. The story of the Yusupovs is ultimately not only about a prince, a palace, or a murder. It is about the fragile nature of human identity and the painful reality that even the most powerful families can become strangers in the world they once dominated. The tragedy of the Yusupovs was not simply losing their wealth. It was losing the world that gave that wealth meaning. Their story survived because it reveals something universal. History can take away possessions, status, and security, but it cannot completely erase the lives of those who experience the change. If you want to discover more forgotten stories of fallen dynasties, lost empires, and families who survived the collapse of their worlds, subscribe to the channel. Every story we explore is a reminder that behind every historical event were real people who faced impossible choices. And the question remains, if you had to choose between protecting your family's survival and preserving your principles, which one would you choose?